This lesson next week is just a little bit specific because you'll notice that with the 19th, it's the weekend of the sanctity of life. And so we're talking into Deuteronomy, and we're looking at something that I think is a really significant topic, and that is the issue of human life and the value of human life and the fact that God created human life, and therefore it's valuable. All right? You can do what you want to with this focus, attention idea. My objective statement, you'll see every Christian can realize that God values life because of three distinctives found in His Word. And then I do talk a little bit about this whole issue that is so pervasive in our nation with social justice. And you can look through that. I hope it speaks accurately to the fact that we are a nation of laws, and even in our country sometimes we see inequity and it seems of late more erosion in the laws and the arbitrary nature in which some laws are conducted and others. But the goal of a republic is for everybody to be equal under the law and not to have anybody that would be experiencing injustice or special treatment, because God is no respecter of persons. All right, related to the sanctity of life, then, we're going to be talking about a couple topics specifically related to the value of human life, and that is going to be of necessity us talking about abortion and euthanasia, and also the whole issue of assisted suicide at the end of life, which is becoming more and more talked about and in some states even permitted. So the first topic, directive number 1, is the clear prohibition in the scriptures about thou shalt not kill. And even people who don't know much about the Bible would know Deuteronomy 5:17, thou shalt not kill. But we need to talk a little bit about what the word killing is all about. Because the Bible is extremely illuminated as far as God's opinion of what constitutes sanctioned killing versus the arbitrary. Are you looking at the wrong one, Vincent?
I have no idea what I'm doing.
Okay, we're looking at...
I haven't come to since last week.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're awake now.
There you are.
Yeah, so point number 1...
You skipped the lesson.
No, the lesson is for next week. That one's for the 26th.
You mean you're going backwards in Deuteronomy? You start today in the 5th chapter, and then next week it's in the 4th chapter.
Yes, that's correct. We'll yes, correct. Yeah. Don't puzzle me. All right.
Gotcha. Actually, we're in the 19th chapter too.
Yes, we are. Today's lesson, next week's lesson is going to be on the 19th.
Moses died last week, but he resurrected.
He's not there yet. He just appointed his successor, and he's still making his way to Nebo. Yeah, he's feeling bad. The word that I wanted to emphasize is that the commandment has to be understood according to the actual meaning of the word kill. And the Hebrew word is ratsak. Ratsak. All right? And it has to do with human life. The word killing is never used in the context of example of an animal's life. This particular Hebrew word is never used for the killing of an animal or in cases of sanctioned killing. For example, capital punishment or self-defense.
How about war?
Or war. There are times where the Bible gives us an understanding that this word killing is unique to the idea of having premeditation and intention, and the fact that we are indeed talking about really a better word, murder or homicide. All right? So I've taken a little bit of time to deal with that in the text, in the context of the text, these words. But again, In the ancient world, the law of Moses was so illuminated compared to the laws that were elsewhere in the ancient Near East. And you may have heard of the laws of Hammurabi, or the laws of Libet Ishtar, or Eshnuna.
Oh, yeah.
And those are law codes that existed before the law of Moses, but none of them provided for this distinction in thou shalt not kill. They had laws about killing, but they didn't make a distinction about intention. And so that's what I've tried to deal with. So the second bullet there in Deuteronomy 5:17, it tells us that we are not to take human life without legal sanction. And that's where I've defined that. Remember this basic principle about life. God created people in his image, and therefore he can prohibit murder because he cares deeply for each created life. And the other part of that is every life to God is a soul. And so that is why we talk about, as Christians, the sanctity of life. And of course, that's going to take us immediately then to the discussion about abortion. Because in our culture, they're trying to turn this into a debate about choice. And it's not a debate about choice, and it's not a debate about whether or not a baby in the womb is a human. It is. And certainly the Bible defines that, and I take some time to explain some of those things. So what constitutes human life? Well, in the issue of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, there's no question. That's a life. That's a human being. And the Bible does not make provision except in God's control about when that life ends. And even though there are efforts in our culture and in other places, they are trying to justify something that the Bible does not. All right. Now we understand that there are when they start talking about quality of life issues, for example, that's just dodging the question. Now we understand that there are medical advances and technologies that have kept people alive way beyond what may have been true in the past. But not taking those issues into consideration, the main issue is people are not to intentionally kill someone else who is neither an enemy or guilty of a heinous crime, and therefore the culture, the government is leading out in the idea of capital punishment.
In our culture, something that is gaining some traction is personhood for the unborn, and many states have already passed personhood amendments to their state constitutions, which essentially ascribe to a fetus, so to an unborn baby, the civil rights of a person. They're saying that they are persons, and so I don't believe Missouri's yet passed
Not
that.
Yet,
But it has come up a number of times. But there are other states that have passed it, and it is gaining traction. And we do have a Supreme Court that would stand with that at this point. So that's something to talk to your classes about at this point for sure.
Yeah, that's really good. And there are already laws in a number of states where if a pregnant woman is killed and her baby also dies, at that point the person is charged with double murder. And it has to do with this issue of personhood. That's good.
Yeah.
I've gone ahead and taken time. I mentioned in Luke chapter 1, you'll see there where, babies in the womb respond to a physical stimuli. You remember that when Elizabeth saw and talked to Mary and John the Baptist leaped, in her womb. Yeah, there you go. The fact that Psalm 139:14 specifically talks about us being fearfully and wonderfully made. And then in this rather obscure one, but in Amos 1:13, it actually talks about a military atrocity that involved violence of a pregnant woman where the baby died. And so, as we would look at the Bible defines a baby in the womb as a human. There's no debate about that. And certainly we would even talk about the incarnation, as Mary carried the God who was going to be born in the incarnation, but God is already human in her womb. And so, anyway, that's part of this emphasis, and you'll want to look that through and feel comfortable in developing it. But again, the whole issue is thou shalt not kill, and that has to do with this issue of intentionality of taking a human life.
Fearfully and wonderfully made doesn't kick in afterward.
Correct. Yeah, correct. Good point. All right. Then to further expand God's graciousness in this whole topic, the next two bullets deal with the issue of cities of refuge. And this is, again, such a high and illuminated position for laws in the ancient Near East. But God understood, and so did Moses, that there would be circumstances where someone would kill someone else, but it was without intentionality. It was accidental. And the Bible provided for what happens in the case of an accidental killing. Well, again, there's a distinction there between murder or homicide, which is an intentional, premeditated thing, versus accidentally killing someone. But in the ancient world, they did not have any provision for that. In fact, as I've described here in this first bullet under grace, and you'll want to look at Deuteronomy 19:4-10, where it deals with the cities of refuge from Moses' point of view in Deuteronomy. But we talk about a family member. There were no police forces. So when someone died, there was no investigation. There was no effort to determine intentionality of what happened here. Was this a premeditated murder or not? So in the ancient world, a family member of the dead person would immediately take the responsibility of blood vengeance. And I even put in parenthetic, the literal is blood redeemer. And so Moses and God in particular, established these cities of refuge. It was an act of grace. Because if someone accidentally killed someone, well, the blood avenger was coming after them. Well, the cities of refuge were established so that that person who was really innocent of a premeditated homicide, they could flee to a city of refuge. There were 3 on each side of the Jordan River. And they could get to one of these places. Once they were in the city limits, they would then have an opportunity to plead their case and have the elders of the city, a jury, if you will, listen to the evidence on whether or not there was intention or if it was an accident. And so these words were used. For example, it says if a person inadvertently killed another person ignorantly, that literally means without intent. It was an accident. Well, the people in the cities of refuge, these judges, these elders of the city, would determine this was not a premeditated, thoughtful act against someone to kill somebody. And so therefore they would declare that the person was maybe guilty of like manslaughter, but not homicide or murder. And they would not punish the person for accidentally killing. Okay, so that's a really important thing. But as you might notice in the next point, justice, we've got to wrap this up, but
Was there any punishment for a manslaughter?
not if it was just a pure accident. They would just forgive them of something that appeared to be totally by chance.
There was still some reparations, so like if
That's
people
true.
were taking away their livelihood for their family.
That's true. There could be some restitution that might be made. Yeah, good point. Yeah,
Now,
thank you.
would the person have to stay in the city of refuge? If he would,
They could stay in the city of refuge in order to completely avoid any blood vengeance. However, that's this next point. A person might say, oh, it was an accident, and run to a city of refuge in order to secure themselves, even though they really were guilty of a premeditated murder. And so that's when the city elders would determine, and if they determined that the person really was guilty of murder, homicide, they would at that point extradite the person out of the city and turn them over to the blood avenger.
That's not good.
No, and they were basically sanctioning capital punishment at that point. Yes, this is legal, and it's right, and it's justice. that this person, a life for a life. And the other point, back to that gracious part, if a person who was the blood avenger tried to come into the city and actually still avenge without there being a due process, then that person was guilty of murder and would be executed. And so, again, very illuminated legal position for the ancient world.
They use stony bricks.
And yes, and possibly some other methods as well.
Electric chair.
I am not aware of electric chair. This is what I want to remind you of, though. And I didn't talk much about capital punishment, except that it is one of the legally sanctioned things that the state would enact upon a person, a life for a life. And there's a lot of debate on that, but the book of Deuteronomy actually requires death for murderers precisely because human life is sacred.
It's actually in the Noahic covenant as well.
It is. Well, no, yes, good. Excellent. That's the very first place it's introduced, the idea of capital punishment, the fact that governments could enact judgment against people. Taking human life is so heinous and so defiling that the one who committed such a crime could not be permitted to live. Unfortunately, as you see there in my italics, in a violent society, life is cheap. Don't we see that going on in our world? That life is cheap, and yet justice demands equity before the law. Okay? So anyway, I think that this is a deep and important issue, but it's also a very current event issue. So I think your people will be really interested in what we're talking about.
Raised in a